They say the Middle Ages were a time of honor, chivalry, and glory. But step onto a real battlefield back then, and you'd see something very different. War in the medieval world was dirty, brutal, and unforgiving. Forget elegant sword fights or noble duels. Soldiers used whatever they could to crush, tear, or rip through their enemies as quickly as possible. In a time when survival came down to milliseconds, some weapons were designed to end fights instantly. No second chances, no recovery. Today, we're diving into 6 medieval weapons that didn't just wound you, they destroyed you. These weren't just tools of war. They were built to break armor, bones, and morale in seconds. Number 1, the Morning Star. The Morning Star was one of the most brutal and fear-inducing weapons used during the medieval period. It wasn't created for style, status, or ceremony. It was engineered specifically to cause catastrophic damage in close-quarters combat. At its core, the Morning Star was a simple yet horrifyingly effective design. A solid shaft made of either wood or metal, capped with a heavy spiked ball. Sometimes, the spiked head was directly affixed to the shaft, and in other versions it was connected by a short chain that allowed for more momentum upon striking. Despite the superficial similarity to the flail, the Morning Star was distinct in that the spiked head was usually rigid and not free-swinging. This gave the wielder greater control and allowed for more precise, devastating strikes. The weapon was specifically designed to counter the growing use of armor on the battlefield. As knights and soldiers increasingly relied on plate and chainmail to protect themselves, traditional bladed weapons began to lose some of their effectiveness. Swords could glance off a breastplate or get caught in rings of mail, but the Morning Star didn't rely on cutting or slashing. It relied on sheer kinetic force. When swung with full strength, it delivered concentrated impact through its narrow, pointed spikes. Even if the spike didn't fully penetrate the armor, the crushing force beneath could easily break bones, rupture internal organs, or cause concussions. A direct hit to the helmet, for example, might not pierce the steel, but it could still crush the skull beneath or knock the victim unconscious. In chaotic melee combat, where movement was restricted and engagements were up close and personal, the Morning Star became an especially terrifying threat. Soldiers on foot often had little time to react, and one blow from this weapon could end a fight instantly. It didn't require years of training to use effectively. Unlike the longsword, which demanded technique and skill, the Morning Star could be wielded with raw aggression and brute strength. This made it an ideal weapon for militias, peasant levies, and common infantry who might not have had the luxury of formal martial instruction. Another reason for its widespread use was its practicality and affordability. The materials were relatively easy to obtain and assemble, making the Morning Star an accessible choice for poorly funded armies or feudal lords arming large groups of men. Despite its simple construction, it was a psychologically powerful weapon. Facing someone holding a Morning Star meant facing an opponent who didn't need to be fast, refined, or even particularly accurate. They only needed to hit you once. In siege warfare, skirmishes, or battlefield formations, the Morning Star proved itself over and over as a weapon that could punch above its weight. It wasn't the most elegant instrument of war, but its reliability, ease of use, and sheer destructive potential earned it a fearsome reputation. Soldiers knew that if they got caught within striking distance of a Morning Star, even the best armor might not save them. Number 2, the War Scythe. The War Scythe is one of the most striking examples of how everyday tools were transformed into deadly battlefield weapons. It didn't start as a weapon designed for war. It began as a simple agricultural tool used by peasants to harvest crops. But when large groups of common folk were forced into armed conflict, especially during uprisings or defensive campaigns, they didn't have access to swords, maces, or professionally crafted arms. They adapted what they already knew, and the scythe, once just a tool for cutting wheat, became something far more dangerous once it was modified for battle. The transformation was straightforward but effective. The blade of a standard farming scythe was mounted vertically onto a long wooden shaft, usually reinforced to withstand the shock of combat. The result was a pole weapon with a long, inward curving blade that could be used not only to slash but also to hook and pull. The length gave it reach, allowing a fighter to strike from a distance or from behind a defensive line. The curvature of the blade wasn't just a relic from its agricultural roots, it had a practical purpose on the battlefield. That curve allowed it to get around shields, snag at limbs, or even catch onto parts of armor, making it especially effective against mounted soldiers. A skilled wielder could use the War Scythe to destabilize cavalry, pulling riders off their horses or cutting at their exposed legs. And because of the leverage from the long handle, even someone without great physical strength could generate enough momentum to deal serious damage. The sharpened edge, often reforged or hardened for battle, could cut deeply into flesh and cause devastating wounds. Against lightly armored troops, it was lethal. Even against chainmail or padded garments, the sheer force of a swing could cause disabling injuries. Although the War Scythe wasn't as durable or balanced as weapons designed by blacksmiths, that didn't matter in the chaos of mass combat. What mattered more was how it could be used in formation. During peasant uprisings and defensive battles, entire lines of fighters armed with war scythes could move together, sweeping their weapons side to side in synchronized motions. This created a kind of wall of blades, unrefined but brutally effective. Enemy troops, even trained ones, often hesitated before charging into a line of long, jagged weapons wielded by people who had nothing to lose. And there was a deeper psychological layer to it as well. A battlefield filled with men and women carrying repurposed farming tools carried a certain kind of intensity. It wasn't just a fight for power or land, it was survival. The War Scythe represented desperation turned into resistance. Its presence alone sent a clear message. These people weren't professional soldiers, but they were still ready to tear you apart if you came close. That raw aggression made the War Scythe not just a tool of necessity, but one of terror. Number 3, the Bec de Corbin. The Bec de Corbin was a weapon built with a very clear purpose in mind, breaking through the toughest armor and taking down heavily protected opponents in the most efficient way possible. The name translates from Old French as raven's beak, and that's exactly what its pointed back spike resembled. But unlike many medieval weapons that were designed to cut or slash, the Bec de Corbin was focused entirely on concentrated impact, puncturing power, and precise targeting. It wasn't about wild swinging or overwhelming force. This was a tactical tool, engineered for calculated strikes that exploited the vulnerabilities in even the most advanced armor of the late medieval period. Structurally, the Bec de Corbin was a type of polearm, often mounted on a shaft about 5 to 6 feet in length, allowing the user to strike with leverage and control while maintaining a relatively safe distance. It featured a multifunctional head, a hammer-like surface on one side, a long, narrow, beak-shaped spike on the other, and often a smaller top spike or thrusting blade. Each part of this weapon had a role in the fight. The hammer side was used to crush and deform plate armor, especially helmets, breastplates, and limb protection. Even if it didn't break through, the concussive force could knock a knight off balance or stun them long enough for a follow-up. The true danger, however, came from the beak itself. It was narrow, hardened, and specifically shaped to target gaps in armor, under the arms, behind the knees, at the base of the neck, or between plates. A well-placed thrust could puncture chainmail and padding and reach arteries or organs, ending a fight almost immediately. Soldiers trained with the Bec de Corbin didn't just swing it aimlessly. They'd learn to identify weak points and time their strikes. Unlike heavier, less precise weapons, this one rewarded skill and awareness over brute strength. It was often used in tight melee situations or during duels where one clean strike could turn the tide. The top spike added another layer of functionality. In moments when the opponent was knocked down or immobilized, that upper point could be used to finish the job with a downward thrust. On the battlefield, if someone went to the ground wearing full plate, it could be difficult to penetrate with a sword, but the Bec de Corbin was designed to take full advantage of such situations. It gave foot soldiers a way to fight armored cavalry on even terms, especially in mixed engagements where mobility was limited. What made the Bec de Corbin truly effective was its combination of adaptability and focus. It didn't try to do everything, it did a few things very well. It punished armor, exploited structural weaknesses, and gave its wielder options depending on the moment. In the hands of someone trained, it was as deadly as it was precise. It was a weapon that required a sharp mind and a steady hand, and on a chaotic battlefield, that made it especially dangerous. Number 4, the Mancatcher. The Mancatcher was a weapon that didn't rely on bloodshed to instill fear. Unlike swords, axes, or maces that were designed to kill or maim directly, the Mancatcher was all about control, capture, and humiliation. Its design was entirely different from most other medieval weapons. It looked more like a tool than something you'd take to a battlefield, but its effectiveness in the right context made it a uniquely terrifying part of medieval warfare, especially for those in command or riding into combat with confidence in their armor and status. At its core, the Mancatcher consisted of a long pole with a special mechanism at one end. This mechanism usually resembled a large, circular or U-shaped metal collar, often with spring-loaded or hinged prongs lined with inward-facing spikes or blunt bars. The opening was wide enough to slip around a person's neck, torso, or limbs, but tight enough to keep them held firmly once trapped. The inner spikes weren't always meant to pierce flesh, although in some versions they could, but instead to make escape extremely painful or outright impossible. Once someone was inside the grip of this device, they were stuck, unable to back out or twist free without injuring themselves. The primary function of the Mancatcher was to pull mounted knights off their horses or remove individuals from tight formations without killing them on the spot. This made it particularly useful during sieges, riots, or situations where capturing someone alive was more valuable than leaving them dead on the ground. Elite guards or castle defenders might use it to subdue nobles, officers, or rebellious prisoners. It was also deployed in scenarios where killing might cause political complications or where interrogation was the goal. And because of its reach, thanks to the length of the shaft, it allowed the user to keep some distance from the target while still maintaining control. Even for those wearing full armor, the Mancatcher was a serious threat. The force of being yanked backwards or sideways could be enough to pull a rider out of the saddle or throw a man to the ground. The pressure from the metal collar could choke or crush, especially if the victim struggled. Once down, a trapped fighter was defenseless, unable to use their weapon or even stand properly. From that point on, what happened depended entirely on who was holding the pole. It could mean capture, imprisonment, or execution. There was also a psychological element to the Mancatcher that should not be underestimated. Being dragged helplessly from a horse or restrained in full view of your comrades carried a deep sense of shame. It stripped away the image of power and control that armored knights or military leaders often relied on. To be taken alive with such a tool meant not only defeat but public humiliation. In a time when honor and reputation were vital to social standing, this kind of capture could ruin more than just a battle. It could tarnish a legacy. That's why, despite its non-lethal design, the Mancatcher held a place among the most feared tools of the medieval arsenal. Number 5. The Greatsword. The Greatsword wasn't just an oversized weapon. It was a battlefield tool that required strength, skill, and serious discipline to master. Known for its intimidating size, this two-handed sword often measured between 5 and 6 feet in length, and in some cases, even more. Its scale alone set it apart from most other swords of the time, but what made it truly effective wasn't just its mass. It was how it was used. This weapon was designed not for duels or ornamental display, but for large-scale combat, where clearing space and breaking enemy formations could shift the tide of a battle. When wielded correctly, the Greatsword could deliver massive sweeping strikes capable of cutting through multiple lightly armored opponents in a single motion. The broad blade and long handle allowed the user to harness the full momentum of their body. Against unarmored or lightly protected troops, a single well-placed strike could sever limbs, split torsos, or create panic within enemy ranks. But even when facing opponents in full-plate armor, the weapon didn't lose its value. Its heavy blade, combined with speed and impact force, could unbalance armored fighters, knock them off their feet, or break their stance long enough for follow-up attacks from allies. The weapon wasn't necessarily meant to pierce thick armor, it was meant to throw people into chaos. One of the Greatsword's main advantages came from its reach. In close formations where foot soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder and movement was restricted, this weapon gave its wielder the ability to strike from outside an opponent's range. It could keep multiple enemies at bay, break through long polearm lines, and force gaps in enemy defenses. This made it especially useful in the hands of shock troops, fighters whose job was to disrupt and fragment the cohesion of enemy units. Once that cohesion was broken, other soldiers could push in and exploit the opening. The training needed to wield a greatsword effectively wasn't trivial. It wasn't simply about swinging a heavy blade. Timing, balance, and awareness were all critical. Many of these swords featured an extended ricasso, an unsharpened portion near the guard that allowed for half-swording. By gripping this section, the wielder could use the weapon more like a spear or lever, improving precision and control in tight situations, such as corridors or siege towers. This adaptability made the greatsword valuable not just on open fields, but in more confined and chaotic environments where mobility was limited. Historical units like the Landsknechts, a class of mercenaries from the Holy Roman Empire, were known for their use of greatswords. They often led charges or acted as enforcers on the battlefield, using their reach and brute strength to carve paths through enemy lines. These warriors weren't simply muscle-bound brutes. They were trained professionals, often tasked with some of the most dangerous roles during battle. Being on the receiving end of a greatsword wasn't just painful, it was often disorienting. Even if the blade didn't kill on impact, the sheer force could throw a man backward, knocking the wind out of him or sending him crashing into others. In a battlefield scenario where 1 second of hesitation could mean death, that kind of disruption was often enough to decide the outcome of a clash. The greatsword wasn't elegant or subtle, but in terms of raw battlefield effectiveness, few weapons matched its presence. Number 6, the Arbalest. The Arbalest stood out on the medieval battlefield, not for its elegance or tradition, but for its raw mechanical efficiency and the undeniable impact it had on the way war was fought. It was not a weapon of close combat or swordplay, but its role was no less brutal. If anything, it introduced a new level of danger by removing the need for direct confrontation altogether. While earlier crossbows had already changed the dynamics of ranged combat, the Arbalest took it a step further. Built larger, heavier, and with greater tension than its predecessors, it used a steel prod to deliver massive kinetic force. The bolts it launched weren't slender arrows. They were thick, weighty projectiles, often likened to small javelins capable of tearing through steel plate and padded armor with alarming consistency. Operating the Arbalest required mechanical assistance due to the high draw weight, often involving a windlass or cranaquin to span the bowstring. This process made it slower to reload than other ranged weapons like longbows, but the trade-off was power and precision. Once loaded and aimed, the shot could deliver catastrophic results. A well-placed bolt didn't just injure, it could outright remove a knight from the fight, penetrating armor that would typically deflect arrows or swords. Shields, too, offered limited protection against a bolt, traveling at such speeds. In some cases, even fortified positions weren't safe, as these projectiles could weaken or shatter wooden doors, tower defenses, or enemy equipment. In siege scenarios, Arbalests were especially feared. Defenders on castle walls could be picked off from a distance before they even realized they were in danger. Commanders and high-ranking officers often became primary targets due to their visibility and strategic importance. One accurate shot could not only kill, but also create confusion or break the chain of command mid-battle. Cavalry charges, so dominant in earlier periods, lost their sense of invincibility in the face of trained Arbalest units. Horses would spook at the sound of the release, and a single hit could bring down both mount and rider, neutralizing their momentum entirely. Another key feature of the Arbalest was its accessibility. Unlike the longbow, which demanded years of strength training and muscle memory, the Arbalest could be taught relatively quickly. A few weeks of practice, combined with a basic understanding of its mechanics and aim, were often enough to make someone dangerous with it. This drastically widened the pool of potential users, allowing commoners and conscripted peasants to become real threats on the battlefield. The weapon essentially erased the gap between nobility and infantry, at least in terms of lethality. A peasant behind a wall could end a knight's campaign with one silent shot. The psychological impact of the Arbalest was significant. Soldiers knew that no matter how well armored they were, no matter how high their social status or how skilled in melee, there was always a chance that death could come from a hidden shooter hundreds of feet away. This ever-present threat changed battlefield tactics, forcing armies to adapt with new formations, better cover, and more cautious advances. The Arbalest wasn't just a piece of technology, it was a symbol of shifting power. It made war more unpredictable, more democratic, and far more lethal. Its presence meant that the battlefield was no longer ruled by the strongest sword arm or the heaviest armor. It was ruled by timing, precision, and the brutal certainty of physics.